Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ranching Reboot. I'm your host, Brian Alexander, and today we're diving deep into something that's really close to my heart, knowing where our food comes from and why it matters. If you're like me and you care about the food you eat and its impact on the world, then you're in the right place. On this podcast, we'll be exploring the ins and outs of sustainable ranching, talking to experts who are making a difference, and sharing stories that will inspire you to rethink your food choices. We've got some amazing guests lined up coming up soon who are leading the charge in regenerative agriculture, improving animal welfare, and fostering stronger communities. But first, let's just chat a bit about why this topic is so important. We live in a world where convenience often trumps quality and transparency. It's easy to grab a quick bite without thinking where it came from or how it was produced. But with more and more people, especially millennials just like you, we're starting to ask those critical questions. We want to connect the dots between our plates and the planet, between our meals and meaningful change. Today's episode is sponsored by Wild Ass Soap Company. My friends of the Harris family at Wild Ass Soap Company live the regenerative life, making soap and growing potatoes. You can't use a potato to wash your body, but you can use beef tallow-based soap from Wild Ass Soap Company to keep your body clean. Their soap keeps me clean, it lathers up great, and it smells awesome. If you're like me and want to help support all those out here in the plains that are working to preserve our grasslands and our way of life, buy Wild Ass Soap. Heck, they've got deodorant and lotion to keep you smelling good and your skin smooth. I like to support people that share my values. That's why I use Wild Ass Soap Company products to keep my body clean and smelling good. Get some today at wildasssoaps.com/reboot and use the coupon code REBOOT for an extra discount at checkout. Support for this episode is also provided by my friends at Grassroots Carbon. Grassroots Carbon is, in my opinion, the best place to sell the carbon credits you're probably already sequestering on your land. They can help the carbon you don't even know you're storing into yearly payments. Do you need money to put your kids through college? Do you need money to do some water improvements? Grassroots can help. Contact them today at grassrootscarbon.com/reboot or click the link in the show notes. Grassroots Carbon is looking for more acres for 2025, and the carbon market is only growing. Soil carbon storage is one of the few proven methods to store carbon long term. This isn't your dad's carbon scam with rainforest and trees. Grassroots is the real deal, and they're here to stay. Just click the link in the show notes or go to www.grassrootscarbon.com/reboot. All right, we've got an incredible guest joining us this week. Meet Dan Rasure, a pioneering worm farmer who's redefining sustainable agriculture. Dan and his team at Fed and Happy are revolutionizing the way we think about soil health and agriculture with their innovative use of worm castings. Not only are they enriching the soil, they're also making strides in sustainable practices that benefit both farmers and the environment. Without much further ado, let's dive into the fascinating world of worm farming with my friend Dan. I think we're up. I think we're going. How are you today, Dan?
Pretty good. Yourself?
I'm not bad. Had that nice little rain shower last night, so I think life is going to be good today. Kind of
Life
looking
is,
pretty good for the back end of summer, I think.
well, life is good. These rains have been nice.
Yeah, they have, and not everybody's gotten them. Some of my neighbors have kind of come up a little bit short on the last few rains, but I think we're doing okay, and most of the neighbors are doing okay. Are you guys all right up there around Hutchinson?
Hutchinson's been pretty good. It was pretty spotty earlier in the season, but these rainstorms recently have been big enough that we've been catching quite a bit of rain.
Well, good deal. Good deal. So, tell us a little bit about what you do.
So we raise worms and then produce from there organic fertilizers, extracts. I also work with some biochars, different blends. And then from those worm castings, we blend that, cut it, screen it for different applications, whether that be direct application onto a pasture, in furrow applications, broadcast, going under sod. So if it grows, we've got an application method for it, whether that be liquid or granular.
So you're a worm farmer.
We are a worm farmer.
Okay. I got to know, how did you get into worm farming?
No, honestly, I was having a bad day. Um, and I was thinking about soil, and I was thinking like, well, how did I learn about soil? And my great grandfather was a fisherman. Um, and when he'd get home from fishing, he would throw the night crawlers in the backyard. Well, by time, and he built the houses that I grew up in at that point. And by the time I was old enough, um, the tree area that my dirt box and play area was just loaded with night crawlers. And my mom's a horticulturist as well. And so she taught me about lasagna compost. And honestly, at that point, I hated compost, like, because compost just meant yucky, sticky work, spreading out grass clippings and all that. But that's how I learned about soil. And so from there, I was having a bad day, um, thought about worms and got some, did a small bin, kind of let it set aside. Um, and then several months later, started buying some worms and breeding. And so really looked at our husbandry and looked at where we bought the worms from and how they reacted. And so what were they fed and how did they react from a breeding perspective? And so our husbandry all came from that early breeding aspect and seeing that some of the corn meals, some of the GMOs, some of the glyphosates that were in that food and how quickly it impacted the reproduction rate of the worms. And that drove. And so every week I was cooking a scrumptious meal. That first year I got a truckload of pumpkins. Um, so I would have pumpkins and I had a brewer's grain, oats, and every week I would fire up the oven. I'd make scrumptious meals for them and then spread it on the bins. So we got to about 1,000 breeding bins. And then from there, I started moving bins to both Colorado and to Hutchinson. And that was every single week. And then eventually I had a neighbor that had to go to Hutchinson with a stock trailer. So it took about 600 bins that time. And that's how we that's how we built the system.
I have so many questions. How many worms are in a breeding bin?
So my goal was to get each breeding bin, once we would move it out to a row, the goal was to have about 5,000 worms in there. And, at that point, most of them were going to be babies, but then that also meant that they were good for transferring. And when I started, I was on some Facebook groups and bought an elite breeding course. And, you've got to modify everything for what works for you, what works for your local stock. And, their suggestion was go to the store and buy a thing of maple syrup, which was also not really maple syrup, but, and mix it in there. And so really looking at what that ration was going to look like for us, and quickly stopped using any type of sugars, corn syrups. But those breeding bins were really, really built off of efficiency for us. And, I complain, I'm like, these are taking forever for us to sort. And they're like, oh, we're down to 15 minutes a piece. I'm like, well, I got 1,000 of them. I don't have 15 minutes a piece to sort. And so we kind of moved it to, we were going to get them to a good point, and then we'd move them to our system instead of actually sorting them, stressing out the worms, moving the adults back into a breeding. And so the 80-20 principle, and I find on compost and worms, it's actually closer to probably about 90-10, but that last 10% takes a ton of time to get that value, but we can knock out a lot of value very quickly on the worms and compost.
Okay. I kind of want to get you to talk about your bad day that kicked you into worm farming, but before we get there, why don't you talk a little bit about like where you grew up and what you did before you got into worm farming?
So I grew up in Goodland, Kansas. Grandparents had one grandparent that ran our lumberyards, and my dad took those over, and the other grandparents all farmed. So spent time on both, um, and honestly, when I was trying to decide what to do, some of my some of my goals from a farming aspect were so nuts. I thought that I was kind of too scared to talk about them, and they were all regen based, and looking at nutrition, the biology, and looking at it from a non-synthetic base. Um, and my dad needed some help, and so when I came back, ended up working at the lumberyards instead of on the farm side, but always had a strong pull to it. And some weird things led to some wind turbine manufacturing, which in a crazy turn of events led to a lot of grain storage of wheat for ADM. Um, and that market of the carry and the basis, and some of the games that market plays, kind
I
of
don't
came into
understand
it.
any. The only thing I understand about carry and basis and trading markets is they're all rigged.
It's an interesting thing, and we had several million bushels stored for ADM, and one day I asked somebody at ADM, I said, "Well, how can you afford to do this?" And they're like, "Well, because it had some very short term big costs for them." Said, kind of live by the principle that we'll never go broke making money. And so even if we have to overpay today in order to make that money, we're going to do it. But then also know that once we stop making money, we can shut it off instantly. And that's how a lot of the contracts are based. And it was an interesting time. Um, but then also kind of led to some private equity work, working with a machine tool manufacturing company, which then also led to some work with the maker spaces in Silicon Valley. And again, a completely different realm. In the Midwest, we really think about entrepreneurship and very differently, and it's got to make money. Um, Tough road for most. But when we think about financing, it's bank financing or maybe some angel, but the equity is very different. In
What do you mean
Silicon
by that?
Valley, you know, if you're starting a company in the Midwest, it's not unheard of to give up half your equity or three-fourths your equity if you need that outside investment money. Whereas a Silicon Valley deal, um, you may only give up a few points, 10 points, and you can actually be very successful in Silicon Valley without having a successful business. Um, but then also, they don't need you, they don't want you to just have a business that's going to return 10x. In order for them to make money, you got to have a business that returns 1,000x, 5,000x. And so they're also pushing you to a break point in order to create that. Um, you have to create a better mousetrap, something that somebody hasn't thought of. Um, and so that realm is so much different than what we think about in the Midwest. And the fact that, a 10, 20, 30% return may be fantastic. And from a Silicon Valley standpoint, even if it's a software based or hardware based, it has to come with a huge return potential.
Okay. Okay. And yeah, I kind of have a little bit of a few touch points with that, working with the folks at Pasture Map and working with some of the folks at Grassroots Carbon. And I remember when I was talking to Christine, that was probably 8 years ago, about some of the features that should be in Pasture Map. They sound simple to me because I'm just a guy out here holding hold the Palm Pilot or holding the phone in my hand, saying it'd be really neat if I could make this line do this. And she's like, yeah, that would be really cool. But let me explain something to you. That's a software feature. I'm like, yeah, it should be easy. Just a few lines of code, right? Done. She's, oh no, it cost around $50,000 to develop a new software feature, develop a new feature in your software. Whoa, that was a little bit that was kind of a little bit of a wake up call. It's like, oh, those guys that sit at computers and just type shit all day, they get buku bucks for doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Money works differently too, I think, when you're our paradigm here in the Midwest and the plains is land and cattle and crops for the most part. And, cattle can be, if you're doing cow calf, that can be a 3-year cycle, 3-year production cycle on return. Yeah, you're getting some yearly, corn, wheat, your crops. Those are all yearly cycles. And, it's difficult for us out here in the plains to think about, okay, what would 10xing production look like? Much less what's 100 or 1,000x return look like on this investment, because that's just kind of almost a foreign concept to some of us. We're lucky, like, okay, I'll make this investment and hopefully it'll pay off this year and definitely by
Mhm.
next year.
Right.
It's kind of a totally different mindset and development.
Very much like it's just not. And so, this, and, even our name Fed and Happy, it came literally from a trip of tears driving to Hutchinson and just realizing, if the worms are fed and happy today, then everything will be okay and we live for another day. Doesn't mean that we can do the same thing every day. But we've got a great flywheel. And same thing with our soil. Just keep feeding it. Just keep adding that diversity, keep feeding it. Um, and sometimes just living for another day is a really successful day. Uh,
What's your background in? What'd you go to school for?
so I went to school for business management. I started out at Cedar University, the old General Motors College in Michigan. Um, Knew I wanted to hang out around engineers, but didn't necessarily want to be the engineer. And um, so um, business management side, but it has definitely been. And then I transferred to McPherson College, McPherson, and it's also been very much a school of hard knocks. Right after that, I went to DC. I was in Brown Box office and Moran's office, and then came back and ran for state senate. This has been in 2004.
You ran for
Um,
state senate?
yeah.
Okay.
So, um, and then I was with my dad at the lumberyards after that, and then um, another stint in DC. And then after that, it was wind turbines and a lot of manufacturing based.
What what possibly possessed you to want to get into politics at such a young age, sir?
Um, so I was finishing up my last semester at college, and I was home for spring break, and I went through school pretty quick. Um, I knew I couldn't come back. I knew my mom would absolutely throw a fit if I came back to lumberyards that quick, and I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to go back to Goodland at 20, anyways. And my dad said, "Well, you've always liked politics. What about DC?" Like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Um, and some stars aligned, and by Monday, I had a job opportunity in DC, and um, took it, and actually, loved the Midwest mentality does really well at DC in connecting. And at that point, pre Pelosi rules, so much got done in the evenings, and you made friendships across the aisle and different offices at night. And then in 2006, when Pelosi got rid of a lot of the dinners, and honestly, I don't think truly dinner or boats were getting bought by dinners. A lot of those dinners were going to poor staffers by, say, the Farm Bureau of Kansas putting together an event, or the cattle growers, and highlighting what we do. And that may be in a Capitol room, it may be offsite, but that brought all those poor staffers together in order to talk and communicate um, and build the friendships that we needed in order to pass good bills. Once the rules changed, then it made it that who was going to fill that void? Well, the political parties filled that void for the events. And so then, instead of having cross party talk all the time, now you have everybody
Echo
going to,
chambers.
yep. And, oh, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, I can't talk to you. And so I think we created this environment, um, and we've done the same thing across the country too, but just creating those echo chambers. Uh, so,
That social media has
but
not helped in the last 10 years create echo chambers. Oh, we'll
uh,
suppress all the conservative voices and we'll silo them all over here so the liberals aren't getting offended by their stuff. We'll put all the liberals over here so the conservatives don't get offended by their stuff. And we won't let them talk to each other.
and but like you look at Facebook and we can have a conversation now in the next 30 minutes. And by this afternoon, our ads are going to be filled with what we're talking about.
Ugh.
Um, and so it's very obvious that yes, they're listening to our microphones and all that and building their algorithms based off of it. Um, but on the politics, like I still believe that good people need to do good things and we need good voices there. And if we don't have good voices, then we're kind of left to whatever we get.
I've
Uh,
heard that the staffers in DC for the Congress critters they're the ones that have the power. They're the ones that you have to reach to be able to get your message to the person that's actually sitting in the office. Is
oh,
that true?
absolutely. Yeah. Having good relationships with staffs, is, is paramount. I mean, you may have a member of Congress that has very little political experience before they're elected. You may have some that have a lot of political experience, but in reality, and especially in today's day and age on campaigning, especially in the House, is that you're spending the bulk of your time not in DC. You're spending it back in the district, and while a good chunk of your staff is still in DC working to get bills done. So, yeah, having those relationships with the staff is really important.
Okay. I I don't know. There's something I want to ask about agriculture and how hard is it? Like, I guess from your perspective, because we're both in the regenerative agricultural space, and I get you might not have been there during your time, in politics. How difficult is it to get kind of a message about regenerative agriculture? How difficult is it to get that in front of a congressperson in a form that they're going to be able to understand it? Or is that just a fight that's really, really hard because of there's so much, quote, big ag money floating around in politics, like from, I don't really want to pick on anybody, but like, Farm Bureau's got a ton of money. NCBA's got a ton of money. Kansas Livestock Association's got a ton of money. How much, you know, I get that money buys you access, right? Like you got to kind of have a few dollars to get in the door. You got to be able to donate some money, or you're not going to get the time of day. So, what kind of challenges are there, and maybe what are some ways that we can overcome them by in getting politicians to understand the message of regenerative agriculture and how damaging the current system is?
So I actually think it starts with us, and that even though agriculture provides a tremendous amount of GDP, and obviously, if we don't eat, we all die. But I think we spend too much time fighting each other, and we need to be a little bit more open within our own communities, and within the ag community of different principles. And I think if we can start turning heads within our own groups, and that, hey, not everybody's going to do it regeneratively, but it has a place. Then I think we become a much more unified voice, and we start getting things done, um, in Congress, in cities, in our state capitals as well. Um, I personally don't think, I think ag as a whole is very underrepresented. I mean, look at the farm bill. It's not a farm bill. It's a
It's
welfare bill.
it's a food stamp bill.
Right. And
But
so,
but you can argue though that that's like second or third order support for American farmers. But is it really? Because I remember food stamps growing up. Like, my family didn't participate, but it was kind of like, you know, if you're really, really poor, you're on food stamps, and it was mostly ingredients, right?
Right.
And I seem to remember, gosh, it might have even been close to 20 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, when they opened up the food stamp program. Like that, I think that was also kind of when they introduced the WIC thing, which is for women, infants, and children to get like peanut butter, milk, and cheese and things like that, which is great. No problem with that. The part that I have a problem with is when you can go to the store and use your food stamp dollars and buy ultra processed food and buy sugary drinks that are loaded with sugar and high fructose corn syrup. I have a problem with that because
Right.
these ultra processed foods and foods that are loaded with corn syrup and sugar are making us sick. So we've got a USDA food pyramid that puts out the recommended diet. You eat that recommended diet, you're going to eat a lot of carbs, a lot of sugar, not a lot of meats, not a lot of proteins, not a lot of healthy fats. And you're probably going to end up fat, sick, and diabetic and dependent on the healthcare industry, which is another government cluster.
So the other aspect from the regenerative aspect, and I was at Farm Progress yesterday, um, and thinking about it, I think it's with food. Um, that if we want regenerative ag, we need to be doing it with food and our cities as well. We've got a runoff problem at our cities that is far worse than what we have on the ag basis. Um, and so pushing more regenerative practices from a city perspective, I think create some different opportunities, some different talking points that we're missing right now. But we need to be spearheading that. We shouldn't be letting somebody else go and take those talking points and create them on their own.
Well, what does that look like for you? What is when you say bring regenerative agriculture into the cities to help solve the runoff problem? What do you mean by that?
Well, for us, it is, you know, if you use the worm cat seeds that we produce on your lawn, you're going to see probably a doubling to tripling of your respiration rate within a matter of weeks. You're going to see a better root system. Your water absorption is probably going to double to triple within that first season. And then your need for any nitrogen or any other winterizer, you're going to still need some essential minerals. But most of your synthetics are going to go away entirely. You're not going to need that fungicide. You're not going to need the pesticide. Um, and it just becomes a much healthier system. So that's
So
when
you're
we
not
get our
saying
lawns
tear up
back to
your
basic.
you're not saying tear up the lawn to plant food necessarily. You're saying just throw some worm castings on your lawn, improve the biology, improve the moisture infiltration rate, and that's all helps solve problems.
I look at the reality of things is that should everybody have a garden, even if they live in city? Absolutely. But in the reality of things, gardens take work. Um, and
It's not practical for everybody.
right. And they don't have a desire. And, even on a small home garden, you still have to avoid the monocropping. And when you have that monocropping or that tomato plant, if you're not doing things to protect it, you're going to have issues. Um, and so I think win where we can, but also acknowledge that not everybody's going to have a garden. And the reality, a very small percentage of people are going to tear up their, their lawn and put in a native grass. The other aspect too is that if we have a choice between a non-native grass, but still a green grass versus astroturf, I'd much rather have a green grass versus astroturf any day of the week. Than anything that we can do to be reducing these heat domes within our cities, I think is important.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, and if we, I feel like if we really want to reduce the heat domes in cities, we really need to rethink how we build cities instead of paving over everything and putting concrete, glass, and steel. Having some
Agreed.
more having some more green spots. That's probably a bigger engineering conversation. Uh, I want to circle back. You mentioned earlier a comment about learning how to feed the worms and feeding the worms um, a diet that, had some chemical residue in it. Talk about that for a little bit. Like, what did you learn about how the worms metabolize these chemicals that are in our soil?
So, um, first off, never been this anti-glyphosate, obviously use Roundup, but it was what I saw from the biology that really drove me more than anything. And knowing that our soils and our microbiology, it can break down residuals, it can break down glyphosates differently at different points within the system. And what we found for our biology that we use, which I believe is as diverse as we can make it, or no, I take that back. We're always working to make it more diverse, but I believe we have an incredibly diverse system within our worm beds. And so when we put something that was very heavy glyphosate laden on the surface of our worm bed, um, it would stunt the growth if the worms did survive. But also in some cases, if we'd have a little test bed that we do, say 2 foot by 2 foot, there was several times within 6 weeks, we wouldn't have any biology left in that area. Um, Now, if we incorporate it into the soil, into the bed, um, then is the system as a whole able to attack that and break it down? In some cases, have I seen even some forever chemicals or what we classify as forever chemicals get broken down and neutralized to some extent? Yes. And so I'm not saying that we don't have options, but our worm biology definitely doesn't like stuff to have glyphosate on it. That is, and the more natural we make it, the higher our reproduction rate was. I mean, and it was so dramatic that, when we bought worms from somebody that say used a leaf mold and horse manure, um, those worms were reproducing before just sitting in a holding bin. When we bought worms from somebody who fed heavy cornmeals, um, those worms often took anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months going into the exact same system in order to start reproducing at the rate that we felt was acceptable.
Interesting.
Um,
Interesting.
the other the other side of that too is, their body health and, the size, our worms, we can get actually bigger worms, and better oxygen carrying worms, using a more natural food source. And, we feed lots of protein. Like we are, a lot of times worms are talking a lot about protein poisoning, and protein poisoning, you're just not doing anything with the ammonia. And it's actually the ammonia killing the worms. But just like humans, just like cattle, we need protein. Um, and plants, we need that nitrogen. And so we feed a very heavy protein based diet in order to build the healthiest worms that we can. So it's not that we're anti corn, anti protein. It's just that we want it to be in an easy, palatable form. And then the other aspect too is that when we're doing things like that, and looking at our oxygen levels, we can actually get those worms where they're able to carry more oxygen, therefore create more plasma in their body as well, which actually is compatible with humans. We just haven't figured out a way to get the plasma from worms to humans without oxidizing it.
You're talking about blood plasma,
Yeah,
like the same blood plasma that, okay.
compatible, but it oxidizes. And part of the reason why it's oxidized in a lot of the studies is, I believe, from the food perspective, that they've used very, very manufactured product instead of very natural, therefore creating more allowing that plasma to oxidize faster.
Well, sure. You've got to have a very consistent product in order to do science because it removes variables, right?
But I mean, on the same token, like the reason why we don't produce our biology in a fermenter is that we want it to be nature tested. And by nature testing it in the system, it's more robust once it gets out to your pasture, somebody else's field. And it is going to adapt. I mean, there's just no question about it. There is definitely evolution in the biology. And, um, the first time I saw a brewer's grain not being consumed the way it had been in previous weeks, months, et cetera, I talked to our brewmasters about it. They're like, oh, yeah, biology gets so lazy, especially yeast. And so, you know, 5, 6 years ago, I actually felt that brewmasters understood soil biology better than most soil biologists because they had to deal with it on a daily basis. And if they didn't deal with it, they produced bad beer.
That makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. But what do worms actually eat, and how do they? You're talking about oxygen transport. How does that work?
So, the worms are eating everything that's eating the food. They don't actually, common misnomer is that they're eating the food itself. But in reality, they're eating everything that's eating the food. So we want a very diverse diet, or as much as we can, in order to feed the diverse biology that we want to support in that field. And then knowing that the worms themselves, they're going to eat a pretty wide bucket. But again, the wider bucket they eat, the more consistent, the healthier, the higher reproduction rates they're going to have. And so they may eat bacteria, they may eat protozoa, they may eat some fungi, but they're also just cleaning it up. And even say in E. coli or salmonella, we can put something that's very laden in E. coli, it's going to go through the gut of the worm and come out clean. Now, from a DNA sample, it's still going to obviously pop, but that E. coli is no longer going to be living. So the other side too about, when it comes out from the worm, it's like nature's miracle grow. There's a protein that gets excreted as they're pooping it out, which then turns that worm casting into a time release fertilizer.
Okay. Okay. How much castings does each worm make every day? Or maybe you can put it in
So,
terms of production, like I have a production bin, it's this many worms, and we expect this much castings.
so it honestly gets very misrepresented in the industry. But let's say on an average basis, and a mix between juvenile and adult worms, 1,000 worms is going to weigh that in a healthy bin, they can eat about a half a pound per day. Now, we just talked about the fact that they don't actually eat the food, they eat things eating the food. So it's really the biology on a healthy bin can eat about a pound a day. And then the worms keep that stable. Because the other side too is you don't keep that in check, especially on the bacteria side, then the bacteria is going to run rampant, produce too much heat, overconsume the food, and kill your diversity.
Okay.
So, and the other aspect is that you don't need pure worm castings in order to be great for your garden. Oftentimes, having that mix and having a little bit of food left over, if it's stabilized, can be very beneficial because then you're supporting all that biodiversity. If you run a system until there's no food left and it's all worm poop, well, then as time goes on, your diversity is just going to keep getting lower and lower and lower as things drop out in the cycle.
Okay. That all makes sense.
They may look great, but they may have significantly lost value.
Okay. So where would somebody start with worm casting? Somebody that is in a full conventional, full production commodity system, like just trying to max out corn, soybeans, spray at everything and trying to hit record yield every year.
At the seed level, I believe that the biggest impact spot is either seed treat or in furrow. Most of our seeds still have a seed treatment on them, but within furrow, you're going to significantly increase that germination rate. Your first 6 weeks of growth are going to be stronger. But also, you can't look at it as a vacuum either. You need to look at it in relation to everything else that's going on in the environment. This year, we saw, from I'd say November until Marchish, we saw a lot of things going on with biology where I felt like the biology was holding it back because the environment wasn't quite right. It was either too cold, too hot. We didn't have enough moisture. Um, and so on wheat this year obviously was pretty advanced. People were really worried about freeze damage, and it was that we're going to have a freeze that was so much earlier than normal. It's just that, or so much later than normal. It was just the fact that our wheat was ahead on the crops that had more in fur, or the wheat that had more in furrow in it. We saw where it actually was stabilizing that wheat and holding it back a little bit. Uh, so, so not to say that foliars don't have a great ROI, but find that the more you can get in at the seed level, seed treat, or in furrow, that's where you're going to get your biggest impact.
I feel like there's a bunch of guys out there that are just going, in furrow, seed treat, and they know what that means. So how do you treat seeds with worm castings?
So we've got, we make a mix. We make both a liquid mix and a dry mix. So our liquid mix is inoculated with biochars, fungi, liquid algae, more biology, castings, fish, tiny bit of kelp in there too, and protozoa. So that's in a liquid mix. It gets poured on, sprayed on the seed, absorbed. Those seeds can actually absorb the endophyte and keep that for a pretty long period of time, but still like to have that seed go out in that next couple of weeks. And we see everything from people treating pretty in advance to right before it's going to the drill. And just I always find that all this stuff, our biggest obstacle isn't actually doing it. It's Murphy's Law. And it's these things that we don't anticipate. It's the phone call that we get while we're going. It's the tractor breakdown after we just filled up our liquid tank and we have no agitation in it and things settle out. So really accommodating for Murphy's Law is the thing that we're always driving for. And then, so we talked just a tiny bit about the liquid, and then we can seed treat with the granular as well. We have one specific mix that, again, a little bit higher in inoculated biochar, and we started inoculated biochar in our casting from day one. Find that naked biochar is very detrimental to the soil, but if we can load that up with our goodies, then it's really starts cycling a lot more nutrients, it's more beneficial to the water absorption, the water cycle. And then from there, that can be mixed with the seed. And we have people that mix it from a lasagna method in a bin to, I've seen 5-gallon buckets. But the key is not to overmix it. You just want a good consistency so to go through your drill. But when you start overmixing it, then you break that down into fines. So we're just looking for a good consistency across the seed.
Okay. I want to circle back to what you said about naked biochar.
Mm-hmm.
You said naked biochar is maybe not the best thing in the world for the soil, or if I had that wrong, feel free to correct me. What do you mean by naked biochar? Just biochar, like.
So
I guess explain that.
So naked biochar is just biochar that just came out of the kiln, or it hasn't been loaded with anything. It doesn't have any extracts on it. It doesn't have any other nutrients.
Okay.
It's just that raw product. So very similar to, we don't put wood chips on our soil. We don't put sawdust in our soil because it absorbs all those nitrogen. And it takes usually about 18 months for it to be given it back. And so we want to load it, and we want to load it with the diversity in there. And that way we get better cycling. And once it comes out to your field, it's ready to go right from the gate. If you put out naked biochar in your field, you should fully expect that you're going to have and nutrient sink, um, should be predictable. But obviously everybody's soils are different. And it's going to suck up those nutrients until it's loaded.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense. And I was listening to you talk and I was thinking about some of my experiences, feeding biochar, scattering it in area, and then mulching all the cedar trees that I did after the wildfire in 2016. And the places that I left, a huge pile of chips or, a huge mat of chips without incorporating soil. I can still go back there 5, 6 years later and you know, find kind of a mat of mulch. It's slowly disappearing. But the places that I went and I incorporated healthy soil into that mulch mat, I can't find any mulch. I mean, even in places where I left it, 6, 8, 10 inches deep, it's gone. It seems like it just all goes away. And that to me is, it's like, that's telling me that I have healthy soils. It's telling me that I have
Right.
healthy activities in my soils that, you know, we're going to throw a bunch of carbon in there, and in a highly disturbed system, like, transitioning cropland, I could see how that would be a big negative. That would just be a carbon flood and the biology would struggle to try to deal with that. And I'm not saying that like my soils and microbes are starved for that, but when that when that bounty of carbon and organic matter showed up, it was ready to take advantage of it.
Right. And so the other thing we have to look at on our woods too is the fact that, anything that's used for a fence post, um, usually try to, Osage orange is probably an exception to this, but anything that's used for a fence post, like a cedar or redwood, um, they've got oils in there meant to be antifungal. So again, going that healthy soil, um, with time, they broke it down. Um, but again, it was incorporated and just slowly kept attacking it. Something probably consumed the oil. Once that oil was consumed, then the rest of the cedar could go.
You plant a cedar tree, you try to make a fence post out of a cedar tree, and it'll rot off in 5 years. But you don't hardly ever see the dang things rotting in the
Right.
pasture. They've got to be 70, 80 years old and,
Mhm.
get dirt and bark inclusions where they really get sick and die. But boy, it'd sure be nice if cedar trees in the wild lasted about as long as they do if you plant them as a fence post.
Right.
I I
Uh,
I won't use cedar for fence posts. I'll use hedge
um,
and I'll use creosote post, and that's it.
Now the Osage orange I found kind of interesting. We had an opportunity where we got a ton of Osage, um, probably 4 or 5 years ago, and um, it's amazing how fast it loses its color. Um, but then some of the rest of the breakdown kind of stops. But then you throw the biology on it, and the biology goes nuts on an Osage orange. Uh, uh,
Interesting. I'll have to think about why. And I have noticed, you cut down Osage orange hedge tree for, some of the rest of us. You get that nice orange color. You let it cure for 6 to 9 months, and it's almost steel gray. And
mhm.
it's not just on the end. You can resplit that, and that steel gray color is almost shot all the way through a piece of wood. And I've always kind of wondered about that. You Talking about the oils, I was thinking about, there's probably a huge difference between that tree growing naturally in the soil and how it's interacting with the soil versus when we make it into a post and just stick it in the dirt.
Correct. And also, our moisture levels, humidity is going to adjust that too. If it's really dry and that thing's drying out fast, those oils are going to be impacted much faster too.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. What else would you use worm castings for?
So, um, outside of the ag, um, we also make worm casting soap. Um, and it opens up skin pores, pretty much eliminates acne, kills your skin mites. Um, and it was kind of a random message that we got from somebody that ran a cosmetics company based out of worm castings out of Israel. And they were thinking about using our castings for cosmetics within the US. Um, they decided to stay retired, but kind of took that and made some soap out of it.
Okay. That's that's interesting. That's a very interesting how that connection was made.
And
Do you know my friends the Harris family at Wild Ass Soap Company?
we met at one of the shows. Yeah.
Have you tried working with them?
I don't think they've made any soap with us at this point.
Well, I'll have to talk to Justin and see if I can't
Yeah.
get him recalibrated.
And then on the cattle side, because we have the biochar and the castings, we've got a couple producers that they added in their daily ration just from a microbe perspective as well. Uh, Not a huge amount, but just enough to get that in there. Makes the manure more valuable, but also helps on the gut of the cows too.
I Now that's interesting. I'd be interested to hear more about that if there's any tangible results and not necessarily in gains because I know everybody
Hmm.
wants to talk about gains. Oh, did you get another pound a day? Did you get another half pound a day? I'd be more interested in what the biology is doing coming out of the back of the cow. Maybe are dung beetles preferring that more? Does it break down faster? Does it break down slower? That's what I would be kind of. That's what I'd want to know. Everybody else in the world's probably going to want to know. Does it help them gain better? Will it
Right.
make money?
I would assume on the pasture, and it's still, I think we're probably only 6 months into that test, but I would assume on the pasture side that it's going to break down faster. I mean, uh, break down faster, or just be more nutritionally available to the grass.
And that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, something I've been curious about for a while, and if you don't know the answer, that's okay, is it's my understanding that a lot of the earthworms we have in North America are actually invasive species. Can you talk about native versus introduced worms in North America? Any?
And most of our worms did come from Europe. Um, Others were came about after glaciers. Um, but as a whole, yes, they say that most of our worms are non-native. But there's also debate on when they actually came about too.
Uh, okay, I have a good one for this. So Alan Savory, I'll credit him for helping me start down this line of thinking. So when Holistic Management Third Edition came out, there was a part on it where he talked about native versus invasive species. And the line of thinking is how long does something need to be present in an environment before it's accepted as native or indigenous? Another way to look at this is what's the difference between an archaeologist and a grave robber? Couple 100 years, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's really all it is. It's time. I think throughout the history of this planet, if we could go back and have our perfect observation bubble at 30,000 feet and watch the last several million years of evolution across this planet, I think what we would see is we'd see periods of ecosystem stability, and then we'd see periods of rapid ecosystem change, whether that's due to an environmental factor, whether that's due to a novel plant evolving and evolving into a niche and then taking over and changing entire ecosystems. So I think the argument about native plants versus invasive plants, how long does something have to be here before it is native? How long do we have to be somewhere before we're considered natives? Right? Or do we just have to be here long enough somebody else tries to come take our shit, we're like, no, we're the natives here now. Be- So it's interesting how that mindset kind of develops. At you know, I guess that's just my take. It's just a matter of time, the difference between native and invasive species.
The time and storytelling, like um, storytelling on the benefits, because we're not having the same conversation. I mean, we're talking about worms and what they do to our soil, but we don't have the same conversation about a fertilizer, whether it being native or not. Um, so telling the story, telling the benefits, what are our downsides, what are upsides,
Yeah, I guess people never had a problem using non-native potash that was, being mined out of a bat cave halfway around the world to fertilize crops
right?
before the invention of synthetics. So
Right.
that's a great point. It's a great point. Ah, yeah, we got off on a wild one there, didn't we? So yeah, native invasive worms. It's just I wonder about that, and I think that culturally things get a bad rap when they're just labeled invasive. And yeah, there are some things that, they're kind of really threatening to take over ecosystems. Now, I'm, I get stuck on
Yeah.
old world blue stem a lot. I think about that a lot because, that when I think about like public enemy number one in the Great Plains, it's almost for me,
Mhm.
it's almost got to be old world blue stem. I think we're going to be able to get a hold of the eastern red cedars. I think we're going to be able to. I feel like we're going to make good success in stopping the spread of eastern red cedar and starting to control them. But old world blue stem, I think, is a big problem. And to me, it's in a category that's a little bit worse than, quote, an invasive species. Because not only is it a novel species, it's a novel species that was bred and engineered in a lab, not in nature. And I, I, I maybe we'll learn our lesson. Probably not about engineering things in a lab and saying, oh, yeah, this is pretty good. And then turning it loose in the wild. And it's basically taking over the world.
Well, um, we talk about engineering plants, and that's one thing, but engineered biology kind of freaks me out because we don't understand most of our soil biology as it is today. And now we're going to go engineer soil biology. And when we talk about spraying chemicals on a quarter, well, and dripped, well, that's one thing. But again, we spray biology onto a field that we engineered. We're not talking just about a quarter that it's going to spread to. We're talking very large areas for that potential of that to move and into our bodies. And I don't think we understand any of those implications. It's kind of a double edged sword too, because, you know, it'll be, if we start seeing biology regulation, um, it would actually probably hurt companies like ours worse than it would a Monsanto, a Bayer, because they can have the regulations and they can afford to pay for the regulations that are required on engineered biology. But I think going back to the evolution of in our system, a worm casting producer is not going to be able to pay for any of that regulation that then comes with biology.
And you're not going to be able to afford the regulatory compliance to be able to continue to do business after they make some
Right.
laws and
Or
forces all the small guys out, big guys in. I, I was thinking about like engineering of self replicating organisms. And, it's one thing to build something or to build a plant or to engineer a plant that's going to replicate. And I think it's a dark path to go down because where my brain went, we're talking about self replicating organisms, especially on a small scale, that can turn into a gray goose scenario, not gray goose, gray goo, which is one of the more kind of out there things, kind of comes out of sci-fi. And like the gray goo is a self-replicating nanomachine that's only purpose is to build more of itself. And eventually, you know, like let's just say first we develop a nanomachine to go target a certain species of tree. Okay. And it's going to go self-replicate. So we turn that loose out of the lab. That's fine. What's the worst thing that could possibly happen? So this little tree eating machine, it goes out there and finds a tree that it's supposed to eat and it starts eating it and it starts replicating it. And each one makes two more and on and on and on and on and on. And they're, replicating on orders of magnitude. We'll say somewhere in there, there's a transcription error in the programming. And now instead of just eating the tree that they were engineered to eat, maybe that transcription error said, now eat all trees. Now they have a virtually unlimited food source and they start to reproduce out of control and they eat all the trees in the world. But once they've eaten all the trees in the world, then what do? Uh, I guess what I'm saying is like that's the danger of engineering a self-replicating organism that consumes other things, right? Like that could end up in a gray goo type scenario where it just breeds out of control and takes over the world. Um, there's a oil eating bacteria that comes to mind that they were trying to develop. Like, and this was in the news when Deepwater Horizon blew up, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
We got this oil eating bacteria that we can turn loose and it'll eat all the oil in the water. Okay, great. What happens to all those organisms when it eats all the oil from the oil slick? They're going to get hungry and they're going to look for somewhere to go. And all it takes is one to find its way into an oil reservoir and it starts eating the oil inside the earth's crust. Well, that's a good
Right.
scenario to have, especially if we're moving into a world with less available oil. So that there's scary things that we can invent real quick.
Mhm. And you said transcription error. And yeah, I don't even see it as necessarily a transcription error. I just see it as, I
Natural
decided,
mutation.
yeah, the natural mutations are real and they happen oftentimes in a matter of weeks. I mean, you know, this brewer's grain, we used to like consuming the chaff. We used to like consuming all of it. Well, now we know that every week, every few days, we're going to get a new batch. So we're only going to eat the berries now, because we can afford to wait. And that's a very real scenario. And so same thing on the trees that, they're going to find something else that they like or close enough. Um, and then, and yeah, we've got a problem.
Hopefully we'll never have to deal with that.
I think
So
it's very much in our lifetime that we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to create a microorganism to fix the microorganism problem that we created.
okay. I would just circle back and I'd say I'm kind of worried about a gray goo type scenario or releasing something into the wild that we lose control of. And that to me is the scary part about all the messing around with nature that we're doing is, gosh, eventually I feel like we're going to let something loose into the world that we can't control and it's going to blow back on us real bad.
So, aphids. So my perspective on balance and even pest insects has changed a lot over the last several years. Our very first insecticide replacement project was for aphids, and our worm castings. When they were applied in this hydroponic system, within hours, the aphids would start dying. And at that time, I thought, oh, that's really really cool. And but the problem of why the aphids were coming, I mean, is the leaking synthetic nitrogen out of these plants. And so it just kept bringing more and more aphids to the environment. And so kind of like you're always behind the eight ball with the castings. But in a more natural, non-hydroponic system, I've seen that, you know, when we fertilize with the casting, so we have the extracts in furrow and we don't have an insecticide pass that kills everything, that we've got the beneficials, we've got the ladybugs, we've got the lace twigs. Well, they actually need a few aphids in that system, but everything's in balance, and we're not leaking excess amount of nitrogen. And so, the ladybugs are happy. Um, they're consuming the aphids, but then the aphids, they've got a purpose in that they're cleaning up some weak spots on the plant. But they're not demolishing the plant because the plant as a whole is strong. And so, looking at that, I feel that soil testing is incredibly important, but also find that the birds and the insects tell us a lot more about a field, a pasture, and they're looking at it on a macro basis instead of the very micro basis that we're looking at it.
Okay. You said leaking nitrogen attracts aphids. Any theories as to why?
Easy food.
Okay. I mean,
I mean, they, they grow fast. They grow fast. They're looking for, just that easy food, and the plants may not be using that nitrogen quite as efficient as what it could be. Um, so
okay. So let's just say I have a conventional farmer friend. We'll call him Bob. Like, yeah, I actually do have some conventional farmer friends. We're still on speaking terms. I try not to act shocked. If he's in, the typical corn, wheat, beans feed type system that most people in our area are in, and he listens to this and he calls you up and said, Dan, I heard you talk about worms on ranching Reboot. How do I get started? What are you going to tell him?
first, get started with the seed. And depending on where we're at in the season, let's say it is later in the season. So we may have a nematode problem to fix. We may have an aphid problem. And so if we start early, we're looking at it all from a proactive standpoint. And if we start later, then maybe a little bit of proactive, but we're probably in a reactive standpoint that they've got a problem that they need help fixing, and they may or may not have been able to fix it with a synthetic solution. And so, and honestly, as the season goes on, some stuff we can be very effective on nematodes, aphids, etc. There's other things that, given that we don't have a balance already in the soil, and that plant is absorbing it, then timing may get a lot more critical on when we apply. Are we trying to go after a larva? And that I'll use weevils as an example. Yeah. That yes, we can kill weevils with an extract in the spring. It usually takes 2 applications because of hatching time. But the other side is if we can instead go and apply first in the fall, when that larva is getting, or when the eggs are getting set in those stems, we can be far more effective. And we've got nematodes within the extract that's actually going to eat that and then help that plant throughout the winter. And therefore, we've got a much lower kill rate that we need to do in the spring. So looking at where they're at and what their goals are they just trying to reduce inputs? Are they trying to reduce synthetics as a whole? What are their goals and what's driving them? That's the biggest thing. And, not all of our reasons are the same. For some growers, it's because they saw something in their hands that they don't like. For others, it's they're transitioning to organic or regen. For others, it's a market based. Others, it's a problem. And so looking at why they're making the transition, and that's definitely not the same for everybody.
I think that's a good point that kind of gets overlooked every once in a while is, okay, why are you trying to make this change? What's your end goal for making this change? You might be here because you're concerned about input costs today, but that's not the end of the line for you.
Right.
Um,
And,
yeah,
and just because you use a starter or an extract in one place, it doesn't mean that you've eliminated. You may look at it from a very hybrid position too, that, okay, we're going to use an extract starter, then we're going to do a tissue or sap analysis. And we may come still back on with a 28% later in the season. That I believe that when you have good biology, your options open up. And that's why getting started on that furrow is so important. And especially in a time right now with lower commodity prices, and look at it from a wheat perspective, that, if we can get that wheat started really, really well, and then allow a farmer to delay some of those input decisions until later the season next year, they've got more financial options too. They've got still a healthy plant, but they have financial options that they didn't have to make in the fall. So,
okay, that makes sense. You've mentioned several times about soil testing. Now, you know, obviously it'd be like a baseline beforehand, but how would you set up? I guess let's just go back to the previous kind of, hypothetical transitioning farmer. How would you recommend he set up his soil testing program, and what would you be looking for in those soil tests?
so first, I would recognize the fact that we are an industry that uses non-statistically relevant data to make $1 million decisions every day.
Say that again, please.
Uh, so we love our non-statistical that or relevant data. It's easy to manipulate it, and we do manipulate it. And oftentimes, I mean, what gets measured in our industry doesn't necessarily gets managed; it gets manipulated, because we're not looking at a true picture. We're looking at the picture we wanted to create, uh, and it doesn't matter if that's us testing worm castings. We're only testing grams, even though we may have thousands and thousands of tons. And so to expect that all of it's exactly the same is being naive. Same thing in our fields. And so, yes, obviously grid mapping is definitely helpful, but, uh, looking at that soil testing does not replace walking your fields. It's not replace walking your grass and using nature to our benefit. And what is nature telling us? And knowing that we've got a soil sample that's going to help us. But when we get connected to our land, things get easier and we can drop our stress load too.
Who is it that says the most important input you can have on your farm is your shadow or your footsteps?
Yeah.
Seems like that'd be a good one. What have we missed, Dan?
Probably a lot, but um, get started. The best time for biology is yesterday. So today will work just fine. And obviously we always have timing issues, but there's too many of us that, wish that we would have planted that tree 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Get started, make observations, build from points of strength. That do you have an area that collects water? Um, you always see rain off or runoff. I got laughed at last night. Um, it started raining. And so I grabbed a bag of worm castings last night and started dumping worm castings by every downspout, knowing that nature was going to do our work and nature was going to carry that biology around. Look for the opportunities for easy wins. Um, and we don't have to do all the work. We've got to work smarter, not harder. And I know it's an easy cliche, but nature will help us move this biology in a way that's very successful. And then it can start telling us other things too.
Okay. Okay. Well, want to give you the opportunity to let you have the last word. If you'd like to have it, let people know where they can find you, learn more, buy some worm castings.
So
The
we're
the
at
world is yours, sir.
so we're at fedandhappy.com. That's the N is in. Um, and our agriculture side, our products are there, but rely a lot on phone calls, a lot on that consulting because everyone's application is slightly different. We're all starting from a different point. We've got a lot of variables. Um, and what works for Brian is not necessarily going to work in Montana. It doesn't mean that it won't work here. It's not that, but we may need to make adjustments. Um, and so taking all that into account. So get started, test, big proponent of shoot bullets and cannonballs, but also sometimes also look for easy wins. Look for the data that people already have, so that's why I like the in-furrow, is that the in-furrow gives us that opportunity to get that plant started, and then we can continue to make adjustments. So that first year, your only adjustment may be you start with in-furrow and the rest of the system is still the same. And then the next year you look at, I really like that. And the soil has made this much movement. I can start with in-furrow, and then I'm going to do a foliar pass too. You don't have to take the whole apple in one bite. And we didn't get here in a day. We're not going to get to a foliar regen in a day either. The other aspect is that driving to zero is a folly, that we're not going to get to zero. And at the end of the day, especially as Americans, we're capitalists and we want to get as much yield as we can. And the drive to zero ends up leaving us exposed, doesn't save us any money at the end, and it puts the biology in a stressful position too. So don't be afraid to spend some money, even if you look at it as just good insurance for your fields as well. And I think the last thing is that biology is absorbed differently throughout the season. So an in-furrow diversity is going to be different than foliar diversity, and acknowledging that, and don't expect the silver bullet.
I think that's a great place to end. There's no silver bullets that'll actually move you forward long term. It might feel good in the short term, but most of them are just going to be band-aids that are going to kind of hamper you in the long run.
Yep.
All right. Dan from Fed and Happy. Thanks for your time today. Sure appreciate you, buddy.
Thank you, Brian.
Yep. All right, gang. You guys have a great week. We'll see you. Hey there. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. I appreciate you. I hate to ask, but since you're already here, to just take a moment to make sure you're following me on social media. You can find me on all social media platforms as Red Hills Rancher. Show some love to the show supporters listed in the show notes. Leave a review or share this podcast with your friends and networks if it resonated with you. I'll be back next week with another episode to reboot your thinking about farming, ranching, food systems, and the people that operate them. Have a great week, gang. We'll see you.